we continue to look at the scriptures for Sunday, June 20th, and we're going to look at the second reading from 2 Corinthians. Did I have somebody to read that?
I've got it, Father.
That's what I thought. Okay, I forgot to write that down here. So take it away, Mike.
A reading from the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, love of Christ impels us, once we have come to the conviction that one died for all. Therefore, all have died. He indeed died for all, so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Consequently, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him no longer. So whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Okay, so if any word or phrase struck you or any image, be sure to unmute yourself and let us hear that. Impels struck me. Impels.
No longer live for themselves. No longer live for themselves.
No longer live for themselves.
New creation.
New creation. Yeah. Okay. So when we're reading Paul, we're doing what's called a semi-continuous reading. We read through various New Testament works, usually the epistles, and we read through the book, the epistle, in order, that is continuously. We don't take from the last chapter and then the first chapter. We're going through continuously in order, but we do not read the entire book. We read only selections, and that's what makes our reading of Paul, the second reading, semi-continuous. Last week we read chapter 5, verses 6 to 10. This week we read verses 14 to 17. So we skipped verses 11 to 3. Next week, we're going to read chapter 8, verses 7, 9, and 13 to 15. So we skip verses 18 to 21 from chapter 5. We skip all of chapter 6 and all of chapter 7, and we skip the first 6 verses of chapter 8 when we pick up next week. So it's semi-continuous reading. The relationship to the other scriptures of the day, in Advent, Christmas time, and Lent, Easter time, all 3 readings have a similar theme. I forgot to write this down, but in ordinary time, if the second reading happens to have the same theme as the gospel and the first reading, it's simply a happy accident. Nobody planned it that way. It's just a happy accident. And some seminarians and even ordained priests make themselves crazy trying to find out what is, and some church musicians make themselves crazy trying to find out what is the common theme to all 3 readings. The answer is, in ordinary time, there is not a common theme. Or if there is, it's just an accident. Nobody planned it. So last week I gave you an outline to Corinthians, the three parts, his relation to the Corinthian Christians. Then the next major part is about the collection for Jerusalem. And then the final part is challenges to his response to challenges to his apostolic ministry. So in this section on his relation to the Corinthian Christians, we're doing his his ministry and focusing in on that for this week. It's a three-part message. The ministry is of a new covenant. Its ministry is related to apostolic suffering, and we finished that section 2 last week, and it's a ministry of reconciliation. That's where we're focusing here this week, and it has 2 subsections: Paul as an ambassador for Christ, and then his appeal to them and his defense for his role as ambassador. And so he starts with his integrity. That was verses 11 to 13, which we skipped. And then his focus on Christ's death and its relationship to its ministry. So his first point is that Christ died for all, and then the consequences of that. Consequence 1 is that he has a new perspective on life, the world, on everything. And the consequence 2 is that there is a new creation. The new creation has begun. And then he's going to go on to it being a ministry of reconciliation. I'm going to give you Frank Matera's translation, slightly modified. He wrote the commentary on 2 Corinthians in the New Testament Library series. And Frank was one who read on my dissertation. Anyway, his translation, I think I made 1 or 2 tiny modifications. For the love of Christ directs us, and we have come to this conclusion: one died for all, therefore all died. So there's his conclusion. He died for all in order that the living might no longer live for themselves. So that's the negative, but positively, but for the one who died and was raised for them. Then we get the results. So we no longer know anyone from a merely point of view, a merely human point of view. And even if we once knew Christ from a merely human point of view, we no longer view him in this way. And some wonder, did Paul ever meet Jesus and view him in a merely human way? That's probably not what he's talking about. He's probably thinking about when he heard that this crucified person was being proclaimed as Messiah. For him, because the law says, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree, his immediate objection was, this person cannot possibly be the Messiah, no matter how good he might have been. So he was looking at him from a merely human point of view. We no longer know him in this way. And the second result, so if anyone is in Christ, such a one is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has appeared. In verse 14, he talks about the love of Christ. I think one translation is, what is it? The love of Christ impels us. And he has directs us. And he thinks that's a better, the Greek can be either way, and he thinks direct is better than impel. Impel is like an inner urge that he has, where directs it gives him kind of like positive ideas about how to go about this. And it could be the love that Paul and other Christians have for Christ. The love that we have for Christ impels us or directs us, but more likely, according to the context, is that it's the love that Christ has for Paul, the love that Christ has for all who believe in him. This fits the context better. This is the love Christ manifested, according to Paul, by dying on the cross. And he says, one died for all, therefore all died. And I'm thinking, what was Paul thinking? And so I give you a quote from Matera. And I'm an exegete. I'm not a biblical theologian. He is a biblical theologian. And I was in the biblical studies department, and he was in the theology department at Catholic U. And I was blessed to take a course from him. So he's a better theologian than I am. Paul's initial statement about Christ's death may on first reading seem puzzling. Yes, since one might have expected him to write, one died for all, therefore all live. But he doesn't say, since he died for all live. He says, therefore all died. Paul's view of Christ's death, however, is not purely substitutionary. It's not, there is a sense in which Christ substitutes for us, but it's not purely substitutionary, as if Christ's death means that all will not face death. Christ died, so we don't have to. No, that's a misinterpretation. That would be complete substitution. Rather, viewing Christ as a representative, Paul affirms that humanity somehow died with its representative. These words like somehow. It should be clear that Paul is not referring to physical death here. So I'm glad he says that. And then he acknowledges, although it's difficult to say precisely what he means, there are other texts that shed light on his intent here. Jesse, we're hearing your conversation in Malayalam, I think, so you need to mute. Although it's difficult to say precisely what he means, there are other texts that shed light on his intent here. Consequently, when the representative died, humanity died in the representative, thereby dying to the powers of sin, death, and the law that the representative overcame. So I'm not really sure about this representative. The ancients were much more into group thinking than we Americans are. We're very individualistic, and it's kind of like gang thinking. Somebody from your turf comes over on our turf, and we treat them nice, and we expect the same to happen to our guys when they go on your turf. One of our guys goes over there and gets all beat up. And now one of your guys comes over here. We're gonna beat the heck out of him. Now, is he the guy who beat us up? We really don't care. And this is kind of our response to 9/11. Are these guys the ones who brought down the building? We really don't care. Their guys got our guys. We're going to get some of their guys back. So Paul seems to be into this representative thinking, contrasting the new Adam, Jesus, with the old Adam, the first human being. And Paul is pointing toward the moral implications of the death of Christ for Christian living. So it's not just that we're alive, but because we're living this new kind of life, we have to behave differently than we did before this happened, because we are different. Paul's ethics is he tells people who we are, and once we know who we are, then we'll know how to behave. I think Pope Francis tries to do some of that too. He reminds us who we are, and once we know who we are, then our better angels let us know how to behave. Verse 15, it says he was died and was raised for them. And Matthias stresses, Paul sees the effects of death and resurrection as inextricably linked. You can't really separate one from the other. Later medieval theology will tend to see the death primarily as what saves us from sin, and attribute no saving value, no salvific value to the resurrection. It's the death of Christ that saves us. Consider from the medieval devotion of Stations of the Cross, the prayer repeated so many times, we adore you, O Christ, and we bless you because by your holy cross you redeem the world. Now, that's not a Pauline prayer. From Paul's perspective, it's not complete. It's the cross and the resurrection that redeems the world. If there hadn't been any resurrection, the cross by itself would not have been redemptive. So for Paul, the life of Christians is intimately bounded up with the total mystery, the death and resurrection of Christ. And since I took us through Mattera's translation, we don't need to read a second one, or a third one actually. So are there any questions or comments or observations? That went longer than I thought it would.
Yes.
Okay, how about if you were in Corinth, what would have been the good news? What would have been the good news that you heard? And what is the good news for us today? That the homilist, be he bishop, priest, or deacon, has the choice of either preaching on the gospel, first reading, or preaching on Paul. What would be the good news for someone who wanted to preach on Paul?
Father, to me, it says that there's something better than what we've been doing that's available to us. You know, if we just accept it, there's a better way.
Doesn't have to be the way it always has been. You know, I'm in a rut and I'll never change. Oh, that's the way things are. They'll never change. You can't fight City Hall. What's the point of getting upset about these things? They'll never change anyway. So the good news is that there is a possibility there.
And that Christ himself did the changing.
Uh-huh. That it began with his death and resurrection and
Right.
continues now under his lordship.
You know, it may be good news that we're taking on Christ's new perspective, a new way of living, and not in the flesh. But it's a hard concept. I mean, here we are, we're still in the flesh. We're going to be here until we die. So how do we put our arms around that? That's my problem.
Yeah, and I would think that would be a challenge. You know, what's the good news and what's the challenge? And that would definitely be. And even Paul in Romans says, I don't do. I see another law at work, at war within myself with the law of Christ. And I don't do the good I love, I do the evil I hate. Who will rescue me from this body of death? And there's a lot of discussion about, well, is Paul there talking about his pre-Christian days? That back then he didn't do the good that he loved, he did the evil, but now that he's Christian, that's no problem. Or is he talking, now he's a Christian believer and this is still a struggle for him? And I think that's my interpretation of that passage.
It's actually even more of a struggle for him now because now he knows what can be.
Uh-huh.
Whereas before he didn't know there was any way out. Now he knows the way out, but he can't put his arms around it.
Right.
Like we do. Like we can't.
Right.
You know, we're still stuck.
Yes. And he talks about his weakness, which probably includes his frustrations as an apostle. And he sees this as a confirmation of God's power. He says, this makes it obvious that whenever anything good happens, it's not from me. I'm always screwing up. So it has to come from God whenever anything good happens.
You can reconcile yourself every hour of every day, but you still go back to what you've been doing.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, that's human nature, unless you're very, very holy, you know.
And I think
saint. If you're a saint, maybe you could do that. But even saints have their problems, you know.
And I think saints are more aware of it than most people. You know, like I've talked with people and they'll say, well, you know, I'm not racist. And then I've talked to other people, very holy people, who said, well, yes, I am racist. It's something I struggle with. Mother Teresa often would say, you know, she was a sinner. And people say, oh, look how holy this woman is. And she admits she's a sinner. Well, she's more aware. It's precisely because she's closer to God that she's more aware of her sinfulness. She's not play acting. The bad news is that the closer we get to the light, the more of our own darkness that we see. It was nice being way back far from the light and not realizing the darkness in myself. And the good news is the closer we get to the light, the more of our darkness we see. And if we see it in faith, then we're open to repentance and we judge other people less harshly. I don't know if it's a true quote or it was just put into the movie, but one of my favorite lines from Gandhi is that a reporter is interviewing him toward the end of his life. It's a couple of days before he gets assassinated. And they ask him, what has he learned from life? And he said, I've learned to have more compassion on all of the other rascals in the world.
I kind of think of Mother Teresa as,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, you can't think of anyone more holy, but to me, if I put myself in her mind, I'm thinking, this may be way off base, but I'm thinking, oh, I saved 20 souls today. I could have saved 21 if I had worked a little harder. So she's never happy, you know. A saint is never happy because they realize that they can never fulfill what they really think they should. They have this capacity and they haven't fully utilized it, you know, and they think that, my goodness, they're 10 million miles ahead of the rest of us and they're still not happy with what they've done, you know, and they never will be because we live in this world and you can't be happy in this world in that sense. There's
Also,
always
I
something
think
left to do.
they're more conscious, not just of personal morality, but institutional morality. You know, there's a lot of people who, you know, they claim to be pro-life and they're adamantly pro-life. And I say to them, do you pay your taxes? No. If you pay your taxes to the federal government, you are supporting abortion. There were 3 or 4 years where I did not pay my taxes. Eventually I settled up, but I just reconciled myself that I was going to be part of this sinful system. So whenever I send in my taxes, I have to ask for forgiveness. Jesse, your microphone is on and we're hearing your conversation.
She's really getting into it now.
Man.
She's in another world, Father, not in our world.
Yeah, every time I make the sign of the cross to start Mass, I have to ask for God's forgiveness because I'm part of a clergy that refuses to allow married people to say Mass, that refuses to allow women to preside at the Eucharist. I'm part of that sinful structure. And every time I do something good, I'm supporting the sinful structure, even if I'm doing good at the same time. It's impossible for me to do good without participating in the sin. So it's not just my personal ducks aren't in a row, but it's precisely because of our social nature as human beings that we end up participating in these monstrous evils that we hate, like abortion, paying for them whenever I send in my taxes. Yes. Well, let's finish ranting here.